Hello. In this paper, I consider spatiotemporal rhythms in Sofia Kovalevskaya's literary writings. The paper emerges from a wider Leverhulme-funded project of writing a feminist genealogy of automathographies, a term Paul Halmos has used to narrate the life process of becoming a mathematician. Kovalevskaya was the first woman professor in mathematics in modern Europe, with significant contributions in the mathematical sciences. But alongside her scientific work, she also wrote novels, poetry, and theatrical plays, in full agreement with her PhD supervisor's view that it is not possible to be a great mathematician without having the soul of a poet. Her literary writings were celebrated at her times and beyond, but research around her has mostly focused on her mathematical achievements. Kovalevskaya was an exemplary cosmopolitan subject of her times and geographies. She was born and grew up in Russia, studied in Germany, lived in Paris for extended periods of time, and eventually settled down in Sweden, where she was offered an academic position at Stockholm University in 1894. The spatio-temporal rhythms of her lived experiences are thus beautifully entangled in the narrative modalities of her literary writings, and it is their flow, forces, and energies, or at least some of them, that I follow in this paper through the bits of what I have configured elsewhere in my work as narrative rhythmanalysis. Rhythm's etymological roots lie in the Greek word rhythmos, which derives from the verb rhin, to flow, and the suffix thmos, which denotes any measured flow or movement. Among the pre-Socratic philosophers, Heraclitus famously held that everything flows, ta πάντα ρει, thus ascribing to rhythm a cosmic significance. This line of thought that takes the concept of rhythm as flow continues today in contemporary process philosophy. But not all philosophers or linguists agree on this etymological root. Emile Benveniste, for example, in his famous essay, The Notion of Rhythm, argues that the notion of rhythmos is not attached to flow, but rather to form. In any case, Plato's consideration of rhythm is more sociocultural, as at least expressed in his well-known definition, order within movement is called rhythm, while Aristotle in his Poetics refers to rhythm as a medium for mimesis. The medium of imitation is rhythm, language, and melody, he writes, but these may be employed either separately or in combination. Finally, Aristides Quintilianus, in his essay on music, Περί μουσικής, creates a tripartite schema for rhythm. First, it is applied to bodies that do not move. Second, to anything that moves. And third, it has a specific application to sound. A systema of durations, chroni, put together in some kind of order. Such traditions and different strands in the philosophical notion of rhythm are very well developed in the edited volume, The Philosophy of Rhythm, and there is no space in this paper to deal more with this. However, what this history does in my presentation today is to sort of map this rich philosophical history, but just only to give the context of the great debate on rhythm in the 20th century between Henri Bergson's process philosophy and Gaston Bachelard's phenomenology. Bergson's work on time, duration, and memory became largely influential in the 20th century. However, in the dialectics of duration, Bachelard took a critical stance, not only vis-à-vis the notion of continuity and the Bergsonian idea of duration, but also to the image of rhythm as flow. For Bachelard, time should not be understood as a continuous flow in which the past is prolonged into the present, but as fractured and constantly riven, the present constantly breaking away from its past. Moreover, Bachelard argued that music action is discontinuous, and it is our emotional resonance that give it continuity. As a phenomenologist, Bachelard argued that continuity and duration in music is reconstructed in reverse by the experiencing subject. By advancing rhythm as a fundamental temporal notion, Bachelard aimed to replace Bergson's conceptualization of time as duration with a reading of time in which continuity is the result of a rhythmic interplay. Thus, the conceptualization of rhythm fits in this argument against Bergsonian duration. Just to clarify, though, rhythm is constitutive of a singular temporal existence for both philosophers. But while for Bergson, rhythm is the expression of duration in a distinct phenomenon, for Bachelard, rhythm is taken as the temporal architecture that the subject constructs in giving form to his or her experience of duration and continuity. Elsewhere in my work, I have deployed the notion of narrative rhythm analysis in the analysis of oral stories of forced displacement, mostly drawing on Henri Lefebvre, who has followed Bachelard in his deployment of rhythm analysis, as well as on Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the refrain, ritornello. In this paper, however, my focus is on literary narratives, considering how the rhythm of the poetic order stages the encounter between the narrator, her protagonist, the reader-researcher, and the pulsation of the natural and social surrounding worlds. In doing so, I draw on Bachelard's take on rhythm, and particularly his idea of the instant, l'intuition de l'instant, and the continuity of the discontinuous. But I also make connections with Bergson's different rhythms and multiple durations, Deleuze and Guattari's notion of the refrain, as well as Philippe Laguerre-Labarthe's take on rhythm as the intermezzo between beat and figure. For Deleuze and Guattari, rhythms orchestrate otherwise chaotic instances that elude measure and can be found in the passages between milieus or environments. Meter is dogmatic, but rhythm is critical. It ties together critical moments, or it ties itself together in passing from one milieu to another, they have written. In this plane of analysis, rhythms are important in discerning repetitions or what they configure as the refrain. For Laguela Bar, rhythm is not only a musical category, nor simply is the figure. Rather, it would be something between beat and figure. Every soul is a rhythmic note, he writes, pointing to Mallarmé. We are all rhythmed. In this context, rhythm is connected to both flow and form, free-flowing movement on the one hand, and the organization of movement according to a beat on the other. Rhythm thus becomes a medium through which entanglements and interactions between forces of continuity and discontinuity can be felt and understood in reading Kovalevskaya's literary writings. There is, of course, an important body of scholarship around reading rhythm in literature. Whenever I read, I mentally pronounce an I, and yet the I which I pronounce is not myself, writes Georges Poulet. William Gass has written about the music of prose, which is more difficult to discern and follow than the music of poetry. Prose has a pace. It is dotted with stops and pauses, frequent rests. Inflections rise and fall like a low range of hills. Certain tones are prolonged. There are patterns of stress and harmonious measures. There is a proper method of pronunciation, even if it is rarely observed, Gass has written. Rebecca Walbank has succinctly argued then that rhythmic auditory imagery is prevalent within one's experience of literature, even if one is not attentive to it, and it can alter the tone, tenor, and mood of an author's writings in a non-voluntary, non-foregrounded manner. It is in this context that I have followed spatiotemporal rhythms in Kovalevskaya's literary writings as a way of tuning into her existential need and indeed desire to make sense of two interrelated forces in her life: continuity, her life as an aristocratic Russian woman, and discontinuity. And there were indeed different planes of instance ruptures as well as durations in her life. The Bachelarian intuition of becoming a mathematician, her cosmopolitan wanderings in Europe, as ruptures in the life of a daughter of the aristocracy, the continuity and intensity of her mathematical work, the fervor of her immersion in radical politics, the struggle to become a professor in mathematics while also juggling with the demands of being a single mother. Indeed, her literary writings allow a glimpse into the different temporalities that she experienced as a complex rhythmic interplay between break and flow, permanence and flux, continuity and discontinuity. As Bergson has written, there is no unique rhythm of duration, but a multiplicity of different rhythms. Let us then follow some tracks and traces of her spatiotemporal rhythms in these two versions of her autobiography of her early years. The first written in the third person as the tale of the sisters Radzhevsky, and the second in the first person as a Russian childhood. Both extracts paint the landscape of her childhood home in Palibino, the family estate where they moved when she was 8 years old. Palibino lay quite close to a wood, which gradually became denser and denser, and at last merged into the enormous imperial forest, which extended for hundreds of miles. In its thickets, you never heard the sound of an axe, except perhaps at night, when a peasant was bold enough to steal a little crown wood. And this extract is rewritten later on in her autobiography of her early years in a slightly different way, which is very intriguing for me, particularly when thinking about her writings in terms of what Deleuze and Guattari talk about rhythm, difference, and repetition. And look at the differences and repetitions between the two texts here. One side of our estate abutted upon wooded land, almost to its very edge. At first, this wood was kept cleared and looking like a park, but little by little it had grown denser and more impassable until at last it merged with a vast state forest. This latter extended over an area of hundreds of versts. No axe had ever sounded in it in the memory of man, except clandestinely, perhaps in the hands of some poaching peasant come to make off with government wood by dark of night. The sound of the axe in both extracts invokes time in its Bacillarian conception as instant. Time has but one reality, the reality of the instant, Bachelard has written. Strange legends about this forest circulated among the peasants, and it was hard to determine where truth left off and myth began. Like all Russian forests, it was, of course, inhabited by a variety of evil spirits, such as wood demons and river nymphs. That's what she writes in the Russian Childhood, and look at the same content but differently written in Sisters Radzhevsky. Many curious stories were told about this forest. Of course, superstition peopled it with supernatural beings, fairies, trolls, and gnomes. Space-time and the history of the empire are entangled in these short but forceful descriptions of the wood, which is invested with folklore, myths, and popular imagination, as it becomes denser and denser with the passing of time. The dissonance between the silence of the night and the sound of a peasant's axe, which steals, or shall we say reclaims, a tiny portion of their land rights, creates the soundscape of continuity and discontinuity, particularly in the context of the Emancipation Reform of 1861, which abolished serfdom in around the time that Kovalevskaya's family moved to Palibino. They actually moved there to protect their estate. And let's now move to some extracts of time rhythms. The clock on the classroom on the classroom walls, track 7. And here I have to say that these images are from the actual house in Palibino, which has now become a museum. Those 7 repeated strokes reached me through sleep and gave rise to the sad certainty that now, this minute, Dunyasha, the chambermaid, would be coming in to wake me up. But sleeping was still so sweet that I tried to convince myself that those 7 repulsive strokes of the clock were only in my imagination. Clock time of harsh 7 repeated strokes is juxtaposed here to the Bergsonian durée of a child's time, an infinite moment of brief bliss, as we all remember from our childhood summers. Note how the rhythm of the clock both measures and regulates time, but also allows for the bliss of the instant, the last moment of sleep, to be indulged. And let's now move to the future, or at least the future as Kovalevskaya was imagining it when she was 18 years old. I will not wait. I want to go abroad and study with you, Julia. I cannot imagine a happier existence than a quiet, modest life in some forgotten corner of Germany or Switzerland, among books and studies. The time of radical futurity as discontinuity and rupture is striking in this short epistolary extract to her friend Yulia Lermontova, who also became the first woman to get a PhD in chemistry. This is not time remembered, but rather time to come, a Bacillarian time, where you take up time and you recraft it, you change it, you create it in the way you desire. And this is, of course, one of his main differences from Bergson. And if we are to move on in her poetry, this is a stanza from her poem April 13, where she describes Heidelberg, the German city where she studied mathematics for the first time. Now unfolds a different image. In the changing scene I'm viewing of a tidy German village with a castle now in ruins. All the mountains outlined softly and the chestnuts lush and verdant are enveloped in a misty, hazy blue transparent curtain, green as boundless as the ocean, and the sky of vivid azure. I see whimsically patterned with great arches and with towers. And here we have a glimpse in her poetry, as we said, a realization of her dreams for a quiet, modest life in some forgotten corner of Germany, as she had written to her friend, in the rhythm of her verses, where nature and culture are mingled together in the portrayal of landscapes and timescapes. All these different worlds of science have different rhythms. Deleuze has written about Proust's texts. And indeed, different sensations are obtained by the fusion of different rhythms in this short stanza from April 13. When her years of study eventually ended with the award of her PhD in 1974, Kovalevskaya had to grapple with the untenable position of being a highly educated aristocratic woman, but without prospects whatsoever of attaining an academic position in Russia. Her only complete novella, The Nihilist Girl, expresses this frustration through a dialogic rhythm between the narrator, herself, and Vera Baranchova, the Nihilist Girl. I was 22 years old when I moved to Petersburg. 3 months earlier, I had graduated from a university abroad and returned to Russia, doctoral degree in hand. After 5 years of isolated, cloistered existence in a small university town, life in Petersburg immediately enveloped and, as it were, intoxicated me. Putting aside for a while the consideration of analytic functions, space, and the 4 dimensions, which had so recently obsessed me, I threw myself into new interests. I made acquaintances left and right. I tried to penetrate the most varied circles. With greedy curiosity, I turned my attention to all the essentially empty, but initially so engaging manifestations of the complex hubbub that we call life in Petersburg. In the genre of the Russian realist novel, the narrator's encounter with Vera Baranchova shakes off her world. Starting from Barazov in Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, the figure of the nihilist played a central role in post-emancipation intellectual Russian life and is a recurring type in the fiction of that period. Nihilist attitudes always involved the strong belief in the unfettering of the individual, a personal revolt against social norms that were regarded as backwards and oppressive. Well before the publication of her novella, Kovalevskaya herself had a reputation as a nihilist, and it was because of this reputation that she was turned down for a professorship at Helsinki University. Following this literary tradition, but also her own autobiographical experiences, Kovalevskaya portrays Vera as an idealistic young gentrywoman who leaves behind the comforts of home and family to find autonomy and at the same time serve the radical cause. The scene at the end of the novella where the narrator goes to the railway station to see Vera off on her long journey to Siberia to be with a husband she had chosen to marry as a gesture of support and solidarity is telling of the nihilist attitude. "Are you crying for me?" said Vera with a bright smile. "Oh, if only you knew how much I, on the contrary, pity all of you who are staying here." Those were her last words. By writing poetry, Kovalevskaya materialized her PhD supervisor's idea that a mathematician who is not somewhat of a poet will never be a perfect mathematician. But she did it through the support of a network of significant others, including Kostya Mita-Gleffler, who first invited her to Stockholm University for a visiting academic position, which later became a tenured position. It was also in Stockholm that Kovalevskaya met Mita-Gleffler's sister, Carlotta, with whom they co-wrote 2 socially conscious theatrical plays, The Struggle for Happiness. Here, in the opening scene, Alisa, returning home from university studies, starts feeling the frustration that we have also encountered in the narrator of The Nihilist Girl. And this is a dialogue between her relatives about her. What a lovely picture. Everyone's happy to be welcoming our precious Alisa back home again. Of course, it's wonderful. Our precious girl has always brought such life to this house. She has so many plans. Plans to organize schools, public lectures, and other projects to help the workers. I heard she performed brilliantly at the university exams. Yes, she has a good head on her shoulders. She's like her father. And since the good Lord hasn't seen fit to give my dear brother a son, it's a good thing that at least his daughter. So she will be continuing with classes at Uppsala? Oh, I'm hopeful that something very different could be happening in the near future, says Aunt Amelia, implying that the family is preparing a marriage for her. Even though staged in Sweden, the space of the aristocratic mansion is filled with the dreams of the young as they clash with the plans of the elders. Such experiences are condensed in the Bachelarian moment par excellence. Time presents itself as solitary instance, remember. Which, however, in my reading, erupts within the Bergsonian durée of the struggle for happiness. There seems to be some kind of magnetism in the air. On a night like this, I think it would be impossible for any person with a drop of blood in his vein not to be a little bit enamored. What a wonderful night. Even the air, how intoxicating, how perfectly beautiful the sky and the hills, there in the distance. Oh, Paula, it's so good, so completely wonderful just to be alive. As Jonas Radgers has observed, for both Bachelard and Bergson, concrete duration can only be understood as the outcome of a relation between continuity and discontinuity, or between a dynamic force and a force of resistance. And to understand this relation, both Bergson and Bachelard seek recourse to the mechanisms of rhythm. Space-time rhythms forcefully mingle with music towards the end of the first play, when Alisa and Hjalmar, an accomplished musician, have realized that their long-planned arranged marriage for the sake of the family fortune has failed both emotionally and financially, and they are planning together the Waterfall Symphony as the grand finale of their dreams. A musical narrative, the waterfall, our waterfall, of course. It's a great idea. First, you would need to portray it in primitive times, flowing freely in a wide, rough stream from the region of eternal snows from the glaciers. So then, the construction of the factory begins. Dams are constructed, and the waterfall is forced to flow through a certain channel. Yes, of course, and a deafening grumble from the waterfall. And the surge of a saw sharply and disharmoniously rushing to join the powerful roar of the water. A saw? Yes, it seems right. You are a genius. What wonderful discords could be created on this theme. Then the resistance of our waterfall will end, as all the other streams merge into a powerful chorus, audible from everywhere, from the ends of the earth. Then our waterfall will not want to be left behind. Its voice will be heard and will sound at last, with increasing force, until its roar finally covers the entire orchestra with its highly silvery tone. Wouldn't this be an excellent finale? What we therefore have in the Waterfall Symphony is a reconciliation between time and space in the Bergsonian critique, since not only time as duration, but also space, in its wide-headian becoming, are immersed in the existential experience of melody and vibrations. Kovalevskaya's own fictitious marriage, which was initially planned to liberate her from the paternal control and allow her to travel to Europe in pursuit of her studies, went through a happy period when she had her daughter after her PhD, but eventually ended up in ruins on her husband's suicide. But during the years of her academic position, Kovalevskaya also found a new love. Maxim Kovalevsky, a distant relative of her husband, had a villa in the Riviera, and it is the unfinished novella happening in the Riviera that carries traces of Kovalevskaya's last love in the struggle for happiness. With a sharp and shrill whistle, the train took off from a tunnel near Genoa and rushed along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea toward Ventimiglia. It was the end of January. The morning was lovely and warm. On the blue background of the sky, white lambs roamed, and the whole vicinity was constantly changing character and color. When the sun went behind a cloud, the sea suddenly darkened and twitched with a gray haze. But in a minute it sparkled again and took off. Rocks monotonously still and surrounding mountains took on a pink hue. Grayish-green shimmered with silver. The sea was stained suddenly with countless different colors. Along the banks where the ground was sandy, there was a pale bluish stripe. A little further away, it turned into emerald green. Even further, the presence of an underwater rock was detected with a whole row of small white scallops, and behind a large sail long, glittering golden ripples stretched across a ship. The different scenes on the train to Genoa invoke different sensations which unfold through the fusion of the spatio-temporal rhythms in the novella. The monotonous and staccato repetition of the train engine serves as the condition for a state of self-forgetfulness, which in turn allows for the experience of real duration. Rhythm, thus, functions as instrument of suggestion or vector of hypnosis. Its repetition, which in itself is quantitative, makes the listener forget her or himself and lulls her in a state where she experiences the different strokes as one continuous melody. Rhythm, argues Bergson, function as tool to evoke duration. It is the quality of quantity. And the trip goes on with an unexpected encounter on the train between Maria Nikolaevna, the heroine of the novella, and a Russian scientist who reminds the reader of Maxim Kovalevsky himself. "Oh, how good it is here! What a wonderful place!" constantly exclaimed Maria Nikolaevna. "You know, I'm even scared that I'm spoiling myself here. But after that, I will have to go to the wilderness, to the Saratov province, to take up my position as a country teacher," she suddenly said. Yes, Saratov, of course, is not like the Riviera. Only why are you taking a position this far? Really, you did not find a place in Petersburg? Asked Zvanchev naively, wanting to show his interest. Maria Nikolaevna looked at him and blushed all over. "I'm not going out of necessity," she said, rushing and confused. "I finished first the courses, and of course I could have stayed in Petersburg. And besides, I do not need a position anyway. But it seems to me that every intelligent person can be more useful in the provinces. Here I am with my friend Yulia Ivanovna Rumyatseva, and we are to open a rural school in the Saratov province. There are enough intelligent people in St. Petersburg without us." We trace connections between Alisa and Maria here in the dreams of well-educated young women to be of service to the world, while also falling in love and feeling intensely the vibes of nature. Bachelard finds this attempt to construct new rhythmic constellations in two figures that he holds in the highest esteem, the scientist and the poet. The scientist is the one who says no to tradition, as he abandons the values and interests that guide our practical life. Similarly, the poet has the task to shatter the simple continuity of shackled time in order to make new temporalities arise. Inhabiting both positions, the scientist and the poet, Kovalevskaya did not live to see her literary work published, but Maxim Kovalevsky took care of her literary work after her untimely death. Looking back at this work, I have discerned a striking continuum of how art, life, and science are mingled in her ever. Kovalevskaya's literary continuum is thus entangled with her existential quests as expressed in her autobiography and letters, but also with her mathematical work where science and imagination have been closely intertwined. Through some quick glimpses in this literary continuum, the wandering subject in Kovalevskaya's literary writings emerges as an echo. For Bachelard, the past is reduced to the retention or echo of what was. For Laquela Barth, however, the echo is constitutive of the subject. The subject becomes entangled in a web of echoes, constantly mediated by language and its various echoes or repetitions. Split between the figures of the poet and the mathematician, Kovalevskaya becomes a rhythmic knot. She is rhythmed. Separated from the rhythm of her literary writings, Kovalevskaya's subjectivity is trapped in the myths, discourses, and meta-narratives that have been constructed around her. Kovalevskaya as a subject is hesitant and undecidable because she must always confront two figures, the poet and the mathematician, and thus her and our only chance to grasp herself lies in introducing herself as oscillating between these two figures. What I have finally argued is that narrative rhythmanalysis brings to the fore the catalytic role of space-time matter in literary creation, opening up new analytical paths and insights. As it engages with literary words and figures, narrative rhythmanalysis can never be conclusive, however. It is rather a process, constantly unearthing new signs and meanings around subjects and their world. Thank you.